We have now reached the finale of our program. Again, you have been a wonderful audience over the last 2 days. And before we conclude, I will mention that if you would like any one of our speakers or others who are on our roster of scholars to come speak at your campus, let us know. We can facilitate that and pay for it if you can organize it. And also, we're always looking for interns this summer, but effective immediately. So if you don't want to leave Washington and you just want to stick around, we could take you right over to the IRD office and not waste a moment. Our final speaker is Matt Kroenig, an old friend, a contributor to our work, a professor at Georgetown University's with the Atlantic Council. I have to say he's an expert on nuclear weapons, so we're literally ending with a bang, I had to say that. But I don't think he's going to be addressing nuclear weapons specifically unless you ask him in the Q&A, but rather we'll be talking about his latest book on America's role in the world, its necessary, needed, and moral role in the world. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us again.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Mark. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I think this is maybe the fifth or so year in a row I've been here. And it's quite an honor to be the grand finale here. So thanks for your patience and for sticking with us. And when Mark first asked me to speak a few years ago, I realized that there were two really important parts of my life that I hadn't really thought about how they work together too much. I'm a Christian. I go to Christ Church in Georgetown, an Episcopal church. And then also I'm a foreign policy expert. And again, these had been kind of two important but separate parts of my life. And Mark and Providence have forced me to think about how they come together. And I do think they come together in a number of ways, but the way I want to talk about it today is as it relates to good versus evil in the world. Because as a PhD in political science, I think political scientists often try to think about the world as, states are these amoral actors going after their own interests. Russia, China, the United States, they're all the same. They're power-seeking great powers. And I think that's, I've learned, is not the right way to think about international politics. And so my new book I'm working on now, working title is Force for Good, How American Power Makes the World Safer, Richer, and Freer. Because I do think the United States has been a major force for good in the world over the past 75 years, and indeed maybe the most important force for good in the world. So that's what I'd want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. And then in Q&A, we can talk about that or nuclear weapons or anything else you want. But after World War II, it's really remarkable what the United States did. The United States was left occupying large parts of Europe and Asia. In past periods of history, if a major power was left occupying places like that, it would set up a kind of formal empire of domination. But the United States didn't want to do that. Its first instinct was to come home, and the Allies begged us, no, please stay and save us from the Soviet Union. So it was kind of an empire by invitation. And instead of setting up a coercive empire, the United States and its allies set up what is sometimes referred to as a rules-based international system. And don't love that term, but there's not really anything better, so we'll refer to it as that. But I think the system had several parts. First, it was setting up formal security alliance architectures in Europe and Asia, the places that had just been these sources of these two major wars, to make those places more secure and stable. So, of course, NATO in Europe, bilateral treaty alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and in Asia, informal security partnerships in other parts of the world, including the Middle East. And speaking of good versus evil and the Middle East, of course, I think the attacks of October 7th all brought that home to many of us, that there is evil in the world. In addition to the formal security architecture, the United States and its allies built this dense set of institutions. And I think that's why this system is referred to as a rules-based system, because the density of formal agreements, institutions, bodies after 1945 unlike anything we'd ever seen before. So the UN Charter, but also NATO, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the World Trade Organization, all kinds of rules and institutions and agreements to try to make relations between states more stable and predictable. And I think it makes sense that the United States, as a rule of law country at home, thought of this as a natural way to organize the world according to a kind of rule of law system. Completely unthinkable that if Nazi Germany had won World War II, or that if Soviet Union had won the Cold War, that they would have set up a similar type of system. In addition, the United States brought its values into creating this system. As a free market economy at home, we promoted free markets abroad and open market systems, and then also worked to promote human rights, freedom, democracy, sometimes inconsistently, sometimes hypocritically, but whenever the United States had the option, preferred democratic forms of government. And so people say sometimes, well, the United States doesn't have a grand strategy. We muddle through. Every 2 years we do something different with a change of administration. I think that's actually incorrect. I think this rules-based international system that the United States and its allies have set up has been the most consistent and successful grand strategy in international history. And so what has been the results of this system? Has it been effective? And I think if you just look at the data, the system has been remarkably effective. So first, let's look at international peace and security. 0 great power wars in 75 years, really unprecedented in human history. If you look at the percentage of humans who die in armed conflict, from 1600 to 1945, 1 to 2% of humans could expect to die in armed conflict. Now that number is less than 1/10 of 1%, so a huge reduction in that form of violence. If you look at prosperity, the average standard of living in the world, income per person, is 5 times higher today than before this era of U.S. leadership in 1945. And same thing in the United States. The standard of living in the United States, 5 times higher today than in 1945. Poverty around the world, in 1945, 66% of the world's population lived in poverty. Today, that number is 10%. So still too high, but there's been a lot of improvement. And then finally, what about democracy and human rights? We often forget, but democracy has been a pretty rare form of government throughout human history. At the end of World War II, there were about a dozen democracies in the world. Now there are around 100. So the world is objectively safer, richer, and freer today than at any point in human history. And so what has caused this, and I do think it was the system that the United States and its allies constructed. So you may be familiar with Steven Pinker. He's a psychologist at Harvard and wrote some good books. He's also kind of a radical optimist, pointing out that the world has gotten much better. But I think where he goes wrong is his explanation is too complicated. He says, well, it's because of globalization, it's because of nuclear deterrence, it's because of the end of the Cold War. And if you go through his 6 or 8 explanations, I think they all boil down to essentially American power and engagement and the U.S.-led order. What drove globalization? It's not something that just happened. It was the innovations and technologies invented in the United States, like the airplane and the internet and the cargo container. It was the United States pushing other countries to open their markets, to get the governments out of the economy, to adopt free market systems of government. Nuclear weapons, I don't think it's Chinese, Russian, North Korean nuclear weapons that are keeping us safe. It's American nuclear weapons. Because the United States doesn't use its nuclear weapons just to defend itself. What's remarkable is the United States extends its nuclear umbrella to the entire free world. So more than 30 formal treaty allies, the NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, arguably others, rely on U.S. nuclear weapons for their security. Roughly 60% of global GDP today is protected by American nuclear weapons. And I think it's no accident that the richest, safest, freest parts of the world are the parts of the world that have been covered by the American nuclear umbrella. End of the Cold War is another variable that Pinker mentions, but Again, that's about American power, the United States and its free world allies winning the Cold War and expanding this rules-based system, this zone of security, prosperity, and peace into parts of Eastern Europe that had been locked behind the Cold War, but then rushed to join the free world when they had the chance. So I think that the system has been effective, but it's under unprecedented challenges right now, and maybe you've heard about this over the past 2 days. But I think the greatest challenge that the system faces is from China. China is the second largest economy on Earth, second largest military on Earth, and is a revisionist power and has made it very clear that its goal is first to dominate Asia and then to replace the United States as the leading state in the international system. And that would be an outcome that would be devastating for Americans, but also for the rest of the world. Because I think sometimes people think, well, the United States has made mistakes in foreign affairs, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and I think the United States has made mistakes in foreign affairs. But I think because this foundation of American power and the system we've built is so normal to us, we almost take it for granted. And we don't imagine what would happen if that is pulled away. And so I think some people think, well, if the United States steps back, all the good stuff will keep happening, and then we can eliminate these small mistakes. But I think that's fundamentally wrong. If the United States pulls back, it's not going to be goodness that fills the vacuum. It's going to be Hamas, Iran, Russia, and China that fill the vacuum in a way that would be very bad for global interest and for American interest. So I think a Chinese-led system, China is already exporting its authoritarian model. A Chinese-led system would be one with less freedom at home in the United States and around the world. If China dominates the 21st century technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other things, it's going to embed its autocratic values into that system. And also in terms of prosperity, China's economy isn't run by free markets. It subsidizes its firms to give them an unfair advantage. It places political minders in Chinese companies. International economic engagement is state to state, a lot of corruption, bad for human rights, bad for environmental standards. And so I think a Chinese-led system might be good for some Chinese elites, but I think it would be worse for the peace, prosperity, and freedom of most people around the world, and certainly for Americans. And so I do think that making sure that the United States effectively competes with China and fends off this challenge is important. But there is this kind of new axis of autocracies threatening the system the United States and its mostly democratic allies have built. Russia's war in Ukraine is a good example. Russia's trying to establish a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, reassert the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe. And if that were to happen, it would be, again, bad for these systems, but also worse for the people who would have to live under Russian domination. And if you talk to Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, they're some of the most hawkish on Russia because they know what it's like to live under Russian domination. They lived under Russian domination during the Cold War, and they don't want to return to that. They've liked living in the free world over the past several decades. And then, of course, we have the challenge from Iran in the Middle East. The Biden administration's Pentagon estimates that if Iran were to dash to build nuclear weapons, its breakout time now is about 12 days. So we've had a 20-year effort to try to prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons, and we're on the verge of failure. In addition, Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terror, according to the State Department, funding Hamas, Hezbollah. Plotted to blow up Cafe Milano in Georgetown a few years ago to try to kill the Saudi ambassador, has killed many Americans and has conducted attacks on American bases in the Middle East in the past few days. And then moreover, these autocratic powers are increasingly working together. Xi and Putin have met a number of times. In one of their last meetings, Xi said to Putin, there are changes in the international system that haven't taken place in hundreds of years, and we're driving those changes. And Putin said, I agree. China's support to Russia, economic support, is fueling Russia's war machine. Iran is building drones that it's providing to the Russians. Russia, China, and Iran have conducted joint military exercises. And in fact, the amount of collaboration among these autocratic powers is already greater today than the collaboration among the Axis powers in the eve of World War II. And so I think there is real reason to be concerned. The United States and its allies in this rules-based system face serious challenges in all three of these theaters: a major war already in Europe, one brewing in the Middle East, and the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. And right now, China is testing America's military alliance with the Philippines, encroaching on the Second Thomas Shoal, encroaching on harassing and attacking Philippines ships as they try to access their own sovereign territory. So I was quoted in The Economist this week, which was an honor, as saying the world is more dangerous now than at any point than at the most dangerous times during the Cold War. And I wish that weren't true, but I think it is the case. So I think this is essentially a battle of good versus evil, the United States and its democratic allies in the free world against these revisionist autocracies that want to tear down everything we've built. And so it's going to be challenging, but we've made it through difficult times before, including in the first Cold War. And so I think if we invest in our own strengths, align with our allies, adapt and revitalize this system for a new era. What are the new institutions and bodies that we need? So building new alliances like the Quad in Asia, AUKUS, bringing together the UK, the United States, and Australia. I think we need to be creative. And what are the other things that we need to build? And then maybe most importantly, how do we defend what we've built from those who want to tear it down? So a lot to talk about, a lot going on in the world. Maybe I'll finish my formal remarks there and open it up for Q&A and discussion. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Isai Monero. I am from Biola University. My question involves the One China policy. Do you think it's time for the United States to retract the One China policy? Since I guess we first recognized Taiwan, then we switched over to communist China, and now we're kind of like strategically ambiguous. Is it time that we kind of actually say what most people think or most politicians act, which is just recognizing Taiwan as well? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. And our Taiwan policy is so complicated. There are the 3 communiques, the 6 assurances, and I think maybe Henry Kissinger was involved in this opening to China. I think sometimes he's the only one who really understands all the pieces. But essentially, it's that the United States recognizes Beijing as the legitimate government of China, but we have robust, unofficial relations with the government in Taiwan. And we try to stop 2 things from happening. One, we want to prevent China from using military force to attack Taiwan. We've been very clear for decades that we want the differences resolved peacefully. But at the same time, we say that we would also resist Taiwan declaring independence, which could, we think, create a crisis and maybe even a war. So essentially, the United States is happy maintaining the status quo. But then this gets to the question about the strategic ambiguity, which is what's really under debate. So as part of the One China policy, the United States says we would oppose China using military force to attack Taiwan. But would we come to Taiwan's defense? And that's what's ambiguous. We essentially say maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. And I think in the past, when China was relatively weak, we were much stronger. That made sense. But China's been investing in a military to invade Taiwan. The CIA has said publicly that she has asked the People's Liberation Army to have the ability to take Taiwan by 2027. And so some people think this war could be coming soon. And so given that, and Pentagon leaders say that in war games, that the United States sometimes loses, that if we tried to defend Taiwan, maybe we wouldn't even get there. Many military leaders say we need to make many more investments in the capabilities and defense strategy to deny China the ability to attack Taiwan. So given this situation, some experts, including me, have said we should change from strategic ambiguity to strategic clarity. So you don't have to change the overall One China policy. we still don't want Taiwan to declare independence. We still recognize the government in Beijing, but say that, but if you do use military force, China, to attack Taiwan, the United States will defend Taiwan. And the purpose, of course, isn't to get into a big war with China, but it would be to deter China from attacking in the first place. President Biden, 4 times now, has said that he would defend Taiwan if it was attacked. And then all 4 times his White House walked it back and said nothing's changed. And so if they're trying to be ambiguous, they're being pretty ambiguous. Everybody's confused. I'm confused. I think Xi Jinping is probably confused. So I do think it would make sense for the Biden administration or for the next president, again, not to throw away all the other pieces of the one China policy, but just to say that if Taiwan were attacked, we would defend it, again, with the purpose of deterring the attack in the first place.
If I could ask a question. My name is James. I edit Providence. I've noticed across the speakers we've had this last day and a half, with Bridge Colby the other day, in response to a question about balancing commitments to Ukraine and to Israel and to Taiwan. In response to a question about that, Bridge basically said, we're past the point where giving more military aid to, say, Ukraine, where like the marginal utility, it's just not there anymore. We should basically stop. And I guess it seems like I've noticed a trend, and of course many other speakers have said, it's a mistake to see Ukraine and Israel and China as not being connected. We need to be pushing back on all fronts. You shouldn't take a scarcity outlook. And I guess if I could delineate, some people seem to have a kind of like, when talking about how the United States should approach these different threats, they have, I guess you might call it like a scarcity attitude of like, well, we only have so many resources. We really ought to get away from whatever's going on in Ukraine and just focus on Taiwan because we have this scarcity, and that needs to be like our realist thinking. However, other people seem to say, well, the real problem is the scarcity itself. So we should just we shouldn't disconnect these like battlefields, these conflicts. But then beyond that, the answer to we have scarcity is just we need to say spend more in the military, recommit, double down on our alliances, all of these things. And it's not that they can't both be true at the same time, but how do you see like those two camps as going back and forth?
Yeah. Well, I think you did put your finger on probably the biggest strategic debate in Washington right now. And I sometimes refer to these camps as Asia first versus walk and chew gum. So you have the people who say Asia first, China's what matters most, we have to focus there, we have to do less in Europe and the Middle East. And then the walk and chew gum folks who say, no, we can still do it all. And I guess I'd put myself more in the second camp, and let me say why. First, the United States does have important interest in Europe and the Middle East. Europe is still our #1 trade and investment partner, not Asia. Even though the United States is an energy superpower now, our economy depends on the free flow of energy resources out of the Middle East. Iran may soon be a nuclear power capable of holding the U.S. homeland at risk of nuclear war. We've seen the Hamas terror attacks and terrorist groups from the Middle East resulting in direct attacks against the United States in the past. And so I don't think we can say, ignore Europe and the Middle East, we don't have important interests there. And I think part of the reason we're in the mess we're in now is because the Biden administration kind of tried to do that. If you look back at their strategy coming in, they said we're going to prioritize China, we're going to put relations with Russia on a stable and predictable footing, we're going to get out of Afghanistan so we don't have to worry about that, and the centerpiece of their Middle East policy was going to be renegotiating, re-entering the nuclear deal with Iran. So maybe makes sense in theory, but the Middle East and Europe had different ideas. Russia and Iran had different ideas. And now we have a major war in Europe and one that may be starting right now in the Middle East. So I think it's just unrealistic to say we can ignore those regions or put them on the back burner. And we're seeing that now. So I do think that we do have a real resource problem, but we should start with what is it we're trying to achieve in the world, and then say, okay, how do we get the resources to do that? And maybe if you do those calculations and say, okay, we just can't get there, then you change your ambitions. But I think we can get there. So a couple of data points. Right now, the United States is spending about 3% of its GDP on defense. During the Cold War, we spent 7% of GDP on defense. And so I think this moment is more dangerous than the Cold War. I think most experts would agree with me. China's more capable than the Soviet Union ever was. Plus, we're not just dealing with China, we have Russia and others to deal with. So I do think a major increase in defense spending is in order. Not doubling defense spending overnight because programs take time to come online, but I think 3 to 5% real increases above inflation every year for the foreseeable future would make sense. Second, I do think allies need to do more. If it's just the United States against China, we're about 25% of global GDP. China's about 18%. So if it's just us against China, I think we could take them on our own. But we're in a much stronger position if we have our allies. With our allies, we're almost 60% of global GDP, but they do need to pull their own weight. And so Europeans need to do more, but I also think Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines can do more. And in the past, the model was too often the United States kind of providing defense to the allies, but I think now we really do need to have a kind of whole of free world defense strategy. NATO is moving in that direction, the new NATO strategic concept. They've announced new regional plans. So essentially, the first serious plans for the defense of Europe since the end of Cold War, with specific 4,000 pages, classified document, but with specific instructions for in the event of conflict, where do France, Germany, et cetera, send forces. Announcements recently that countries are going to increase their defense spending in Europe. But still not enough. The requirement for NATO agreed upon is 2% of GDP spent on defense for all NATO allies, but only 8 or 9 of them are there, and so that's not tenable. They need to increase. And then we're fortunate in Europe that we have this kind of multilateral alliance. We can do these joint plans, but we don't really have that in Asia, and so I think that would be an important step as well. In the event of an attack on Taiwan, what do we need Taiwan to do, Japan, Korea, Australia? And so if we do that, increase our own defense spending, work with allies. And then I think there's a third important piece as well, which is nuclear deterrence. So during the Cold War, people often, people today say, well, China might have a conventional advantage in the Taiwan Strait, or soon will, and that's true. But they forget that for the entirety of the Cold War, the Soviet Union had a conventional advantage in Berlin and in Europe. And the way we offset that was with nuclear deterrence. We said if you attack NATO, we'll rely on nuclear weapons. And so I do think increasing reliance on nuclear weapons, again, is part of this. Again, not to fight the nuclear war, but to deter it. And we can stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan anytime if we're willing to use nuclear weapons. If we use non-strategic nuclear weapons in the Taiwan Strait, China can't take Taiwan. And so making it clear to them that we're willing to do that, I think, should be part of this strategy. I know I'm going on long, just one more point. I was fortunate to be appointed as a commissioner on a congressional commission to review U.S. strategic forces policy, including nuclear forces policy, and we just provided our recommendations to Congress last week. And this is part of the recommendation, essentially recommending up the first buildup in U.S. Nuclear forces since the end of the Cold War, including more theater nuclear weapons, low-yield nuclear weapons in Europe and in Asia. So I think we still can do it all with the help of increased defense spending, allies pulling their own weight, and with nuclear deterrence, and I think that would be much better than abandoning important interest in important geopolitical regions.
Thank you.
Thanks. Jonathan, Harvard Law School. 2 quick questions about Iran. So first, as you noted, there have been a bunch of attacks on U.S. troops throughout the Middle East over the last few days. I'm wondering what you think the appropriate response is. I assume you think it's more than the couple airstrikes yesterday. Second question, when and under what conditions do you think Iran might actually consider pursuing a nuclear breakout?
Yeah, so I think, and there is actually, I think, still a broad bipartisan consensus in a lot of U.S. foreign policy, especially in Europe and Asia. I think Middle East is the area where we've seen big swings in strategy, especially since the Iran nuclear deal. The Obama administration kind of tried to engage Iran to get this deal. The Trump administration went in the other direction, maximum pressure against Iran. And now the Biden administration is trying to return to this engagement approach. My view is I do think the maximum pressure approach would work better with Iran. We've seen the Biden administration has been trying to re-enter the deal for 2.5 years. Iran's not interested. Their program continues to advance. We've relieved some of the economic pressure. Iran is wealthier than it was, and it's using those resources to fund terror throughout the region, including Hamas. So I think this approach hasn't worked. So I think overall, switching back more to a pressure track makes more sense, and so I think that means tightening the sanctions, including the secondary sanctions, threatening allies and others to reduce their imports of Iranian oil and gas, to put the economic pressure back on Iran. I think putting the military option more clearly on the table. Bush, Obama, and Trump were all very clear that if Iran built nuclear weapons, that the United States would use military force to stop that. Biden has been less clear about that. He said we have other options. Maybe he means military, maybe he means something else. So I would return more to a pressure track on Iran. I think that's part of it. Second, we have seen Iran attacking U.S. forces they support Hamas, and this Hamas attack has killed a bunch of Israelis, but also, what is the count now, 31 Americans. And so I think this debate over was Iran directly involved in the details of the planning or not is a little bit beside the point. We know that Iran funds Hamas. They've now killed 31 Americans. I think we do need to hold Iran accountable. The president has said we need to hold Iran accountable, but I do think these couple of airstrikes, not enough. And in addition, there have been the drone attacks from Iranian proxies on U.S. bases over the past couple of weeks. And so I think a stronger response against Iran is needed. I don't know exactly what that might be. We did see the Trump administration, for example, conduct the drone strike against Soleimani, killing the head of the Iranian Quds forces. And I think that did strike fear into the hearts of the Iranians and reminded many around the world that the United States still is a military superpower. I remember talking to some Europeans, diplomats after that, and they said, we'd kind of forgotten that America's a military superpower, but the Iranians essentially couldn't do very much in response. And so I think deterrence is eroding right now. We see Russia, Iran, China challenging us in these three major regions. And I think it's less about capability to the other question, but in part about question of resolve. Is the United States still willing to do what it takes to defend its allies and protect its interests, which does require running some risks of conflict, some risks of escalation. But I think the Biden administration has been too afraid of escalation, doing what it can to try to avoid escalation. But I think a strong show of force, some kind of military response against Iran, something like killing Soleimani, would give the Iranians pause, and I think also make Russia and China think twice before they directly challenge the United States. Oh, there was one other piece to that question I forgot to ask. What would make Iran dash to a nuclear weapon? Well, first, I do think they want a nuclear weapon. They have this cover that it's just a peaceful program. But almost everything they're doing makes absolutely no sense for a truly peaceful program. I think this is a military nuclear program. And, the dash time has shrunk so much. So I remember I worked on the Iran desk in DOD in 2010, 2011, 2012. Then the publicly stated dash time was something like 18 months. And then it was shrinking 12 months. And then we were thinking, wow, this is getting too close for comfort. Now we're at 12 days. So I think what we're seeing Iran's strategy is kind of the boil the frog strategy. Slowly increase their number of centrifuges, slowly increase their stockpiles of enriched uranium, slowly increase the level of enrichment. Now they're enriching to 60%, claiming that it's for a nuclear submarine that they don't have and don't have plans to build. So I think on this pace, essentially the breakout time is going to shrink down to zero. I am afraid that within the next year, 2 years, essentially the game will be over, that the program will be so large, there will be so much material that they could build nuclear weapons. Once they move that material, the game is essentially over. So I'm It's kind of depressing for me. In 2004, I worked on the Iran nuclear program at the Central Intelligence Agency. I wrote a book on Iran in 2015, so I've been working on this problem for 20 years. To think that that may all have been for nothing, the U.S. and international efforts to prevent Iran from the bomb, that now we're within 12 days of failure is really depressing to me. So I hope that we can stop them, but it's not looking good.
Jeremiah from New York City. A little earlier you mentioned that allies need to do their fair share. So I wanted to know what your proposal would be for America to get those allies to do their fair share. I do feel like in some cases, especially with weaker allies, leaving them alone in hopes that they'll do their fair share, well, if China does manage to, capture them, then there will be no army left to do their fair share. So I guess in certain cases, especially with weak nations, how do you get them to do their fair share, but also make sure that they're not just left to be bought out or captured by China?
Yeah, so Putin and Xi are helping. I think that allies see the threat now in a way that maybe they didn't a few years ago. Two, I think continuing to make the case, and Trump made the case kind of loudly and publicly, and I think that had some effect. The Biden administration making it more quietly, but behind the scenes, but on defense spending, explaining what's required. But then third, and importantly, I think explaining, and this is something we haven't really done much, but we should do more of, explaining how they fit into the broader picture. Because often in the past, when we discussed arms sales with allies, they would put in the request, we'd approve it. It was kind of an astrategic process. And I think really taking a step back, what is the whole of free world force posture that we need to deter Russia and China at the same time? In order to make that work, what do we need Sweden to do? What do we need Taiwan to do? And kind of paint the overall picture and say, here's what we really need from you, and here are the capabilities you need, and here's how you can get them. Because I do think it falls to the United States as a global superpower to see the big strategic vision. And I think often allies are actually hungry for that information, and we hadn't been willing to provide it. But I think that is something that we're going to have to do if we're going to deal with Russia and China at the same time.
Thank you very much. My name is Elizabeth. I go to Taylor University. So you've worked, I'm wading into a little bit more maybe political dicey waters here, but you've worked in the DoD under 3 different administrations. So with the coming elections, what presidential candidate do you feel the most confident in handling these difficult foreign affairs that are going on?
Yes, well, I work at the Atlantic Council, which is a nonpartisan think tank, but I do have a book coming. So I have a book coming out this spring called "We Win, They Lose: Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War." So I do lean right. I was a foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney in 2012 and to both Scott Walker and then when he dropped out, Marco Rubio in 2016. And, I think there is still a broad bipartisan consensus on a lot of issues. But from my point of view, I think conservatives tend to be a little bit more comfortable with American power and exercising American power to advance U.S. interest. I think sometimes on the left, there's a sense that, maybe American power is the problem, that we're threatening to other countries. If we pull back, things will be better. And I think we see that often that doesn't work. When Biden's pulled back, we see chaos, not things getting better. And so there's the old Buckley standard, the most conservative candidate that can win. And so I think that's where I am. And there are a lot of good candidates on the Republican side this time. So I hope that one of them can do it.
One last question.
If I could take the last question. I wonder, Matthew, what do you think Israel will do if Iran does finally certainly have a nuclear weapon?
Well, Israel says that a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat, and I think they mean that. I don't think that's hyperbole. And actually, Rafsanjani, a former Iranian foreign minister, said Israel is a two-bomb country. One nuclear weapon on Tel Aviv, one on Jerusalem, would threaten the existence of the state of Israel. So the Israelis have been pretty clear that they would use military force as a last resort to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. The challenge is their military option is not that good, not as good as the United States. They're not a superpower. They don't have 20 B-2 bombers. They don't have these massive ordnance penetrator, 30,000-pound bombs that we have that can penetrate deeply buried targets. So I think Israel really would prefer that if it gets to that point, the moment of last resort, that it would be the United States that take military action. But if it were clear that Iran is dashing to the bomb, that the United States is sitting on the sidelines, I do think Israel would go ahead and try to destroy as much of the program as it can, even knowing that it's not a great option, but just doing everything they could to prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons and posing an existential threat. And if you're interested in this topic, I published a book in 2015 on the Iran nuclear challenge that has a whole chapter on the military options for the U.S. and Israel, what they could accomplish, and what the risks are.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.